All right, everybody, welcome back to State of MedTech's MedTech Growth Levers. Good to see everybody. We had some technical difficulties, but we got them solved. And before we get started with today's topic, which is one of my favorite topics, I just want to double check on LinkedIn. Make sure we're live because there's a lot of people who are not registered for the Zoom, but they do join on LinkedIn. So as we double check that, today's topic is an interesting one and a very important one, which is the technology adoption curve. The foundation, I think, of every commercial strategy has to start with the technology adoption curve. Otherwise, you're really shooting in the dark. And probably the biggest thing is that you're going to waste a lot of time and resources and get very frustrated when it comes to hitting your KPIs if you don't actually break this down and understand the technology adoption curve. And there's specific psychology that comes along with this. Not a lot of people study the adoption curve the way I do. And so there's a lot of misnomers and misunderstandings about what actually constitutes the adoption curve and what's important. Looks like we are actually live on LinkedIn. Perfect. We are solid. We are money. We're good to go. And for those who are on the Zoom, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. Share what city you're following in from. If you're on LinkedIn, go ahead and drop a comment what city you're watching from, and we'll get started. And then let me go ahead and share my screen with everyone on Zoom, and we're going to share it on with everybody. Perfect. All right, and let me share it over on LinkedIn, and then we'll get started here. A window. Okay, perfect. All right, great. Okay, so let's talk about the technology adoption curve. So everyone's familiar with this. I think the biggest thing that I want to make sure that we talk about, today's focus is not just the technology adoption curve, but more specifically right here, the early market. Okay, it's very important to understand how this functions and what constitutes an early market. Okay, so as always, we'll go through this real quick. Your early market's going to constitute two specific groups. Okay, there's innovators and early adopters. Okay, now this is the first place that a misnomer or misunderstanding happens is that we often hear people talking about early adopters when they start their company. And I always have to, correct them and say, early adopters aren't actually the ones that you're trying to look for. And this is when it comes to a new product launch or you have a startup, right? Because right before that group, there's a group called innovators. It's very important to understand what constitutes this area of an early market. And I'll get to that in a moment. Not only their psychology, but behaviors, but more importantly, like what are their tendencies, their pain points, etc. Okay. So that's the early market. As soon as you quote unquote cross the chasm, which if we look at it, crossing the chasm, there hasn't been an official number assigned to it, but based on the historical record and some data sets, people like to say that, hey, when you get to somewhere between 10 to 15% of the market, as it pertains to technology adoption curve, they say it's about 15% of the market. That's when you quote unquote cross the chasm. The reason why the chasm is a chasm is because when you're making this cross from the early market to the mainstream market, there's a lot of bad things that happen. It's a very, very difficult time for the company, and it's full of a lot of growing pains. Once you're into the mainstream market, though, that's when you're making, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, but that comes along with its own sets of practices and understandings. The big thing you have to understand as a company, right, is that your messaging, your approach, your strategy with how you deal with early market is going to radically change when you get to the mainstream market. A lot of things change, not only from the sales and marketing side, but product, R&D, so on and so forth. The things that worked for you in the early market no longer continue to work for you in the mainstream market. Perhaps tactically you can, but strategically, definitely not. Let's use a great example. If we look at, a company that has owned the hell out of this technology adoption curve and their market cap justifies that, it's Intuitive Surgical. So in the early market days, in the 2000s for Intuitive Surgical, one of those strategies was, hey, we're going to present the technology, we're going to find clinical champions, people who are innovators, right? Because back then they had no clinical evidence of how well a robot would work. They needed to find people who could see the future with their eyes closed, meaning that a surgeon would look at this robot and say, this is 100% what I would use. I totally get the idea behind this. And they're not asking who else is using this, what are the clinical studies on this, blah, 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 right? And in that process, they would get the surgeons excited. And if the surgeon did not adopt the technology, they would just walk across the street and sell it to a competitive hospital with the promise, or at least the theory that, like, hey, if you adopt this robot, right, then we're pretty sure that XYZ surgeon is going to bring 25% of their cases here. Okay, that worked in the early market. Fast forward, almost 24 years later, you can't do that tactic. That strategy does not work anymore. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to market share, this S curve is really what you want to keep in mind as you're growing through the technology adoption curve, which, as you can see, like, you really start getting into like major market share right when you get to the early majority. Okay, and the reason why I mentioned this is that there are too many companies, a lot of them. Just because you're public does not mean you're in the early or in the mainstream market. Just because you have a certain revenue amount, that doesn't mean that you're there either. So a lot of companies, just because of the fact that they've been on the market for a long time, they think that they've crossed the chasm. They have not. Okay. Now, let's dive into a few key things. Now, I'm gonna try. Let me see if I expand this, what happens. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. So I want, if everybody could, take a quick picture of this. Actually, here, I'm gonna zoom back out. Take a screenshot of this. I'm gonna post this on my LinkedIn. But this is a great technology adoption breakdown in terms of the traits, psychology, and motivations of each of these groups. We're gonna focus on early market first, okay? And I'm gonna walk you guys through that. But then we can cover these other areas like later on in other talks, okay? So let's go into this group here, which is the innovators, okay? And I'm literally going to kind of like walk you guys through and read through.
Quick commercial break for marketing leaders and sales leaders. I don't have to tell you this, but it's worth reiterating that the time clinicians have to meet with medical reps is limited. You know this and feel this. It's been a challenge for med device sellers for decades. Now, with the rising workloads and patient care demands, clinicians' times are shrinking even more. And the window for your sellers and your sales team to meet with these clinicians consists of pretty much just minutes in a busy hospital hallway. The reality is your sellers have to make every second count or someone else will. They must be concise, they got to be efficient, and use highly relevant information to make the most out of these brief interactions. Showpad is all about focusing your sellers on the art of selling, which is about building trust and relationships. And while there's science, the Showpad solution handles the behind-the-scenes prep and follow-up work to make your team more effective. The best part is that you get insights on content and training performance so you can make strategic decisions and invest more in what works based on data. Showpad helps your sales and marketing teams spend their time in more productive, high-impact ways with a multiplying effect on your revenue results and growing your pipeline. So to learn more, go to showpad.com/State of MedTech. Now, let's get back to the show.
Okay, so innovators, traits, enthusiastic, they're risk takers, and they're not concerned about failure. Being afraid of failure is a really important trait when it comes to this group, right? Because your baby is going to be ugly, your product is not perfect, and so if this person sits in a very prominent position in an area where they do not want to be publicly failing at anything or risk any political capital, they're not going to be an innovator. And the reason why that's important is because the things that you're going to need them to do to adopt the technology and be successful, they're probably not going to do. Let's look at the psychology of an innovator, okay? And again, going back to this chart, okay, we're talking about this little yellow wedge right here. Keep in mind, everybody can see how small this is in comparison to everything else. That's important to know because there's not a lot of these people. The other mistake I always see companies make, there's nothing wrong with coming up with a hypothesis to say, hey, if we have XYZ technology for XYZ, for ABC specialty, a new stent, for interventional cardiologists, right? It's okay. You can hypothesize and say, hey, let's look at the publications and let's look at who adopted, new technology earlier on. The problem with that is that it strongly biases you and your attentions and your resources to somebody who may fit that, but maybe not. Just because somebody adopted technology in the past doesn't mean that they're going to do the same thing with your product, okay? Everybody changes. And the best way I can give this as an example, think about yourself as a consumer. There are some things in your life that you probably were one of the first 100,000, 10,000 people to buy because you're like, You saw something, you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. You didn't care who else was using it, etc. You just bought it, right? For me, a great example that I always use that for myself as a consumer, I have a garage gym, and like any new like random piece of equipment that comes out, if it makes sense to me, where I'm like, oh, that's a great like device or equipment to work out this one extremely specific muscle, I'll buy it. I literally don't care who else is using it, if it's been vetted or anything. If it makes sense to me, I'm willing to try it. I'm literally willing to spend money and see if it works or not. On the other side, let's look at books. I'm kind of a late adopter when it comes to books. You wouldn't think of that when it comes to my library. There's a lot of authors who come across my channel. They're like, oh, this guy will definitely read my book because he has his own library, he's into books. I'm actually not into adopting books when they first get published, unless it's by a very reputable author. I don't do that. For the most part, when I buy books, I want to know, okay, well, who else has recommended this book? How many reviews are there, etc. I want to make sure that, like, if I'm buying a book, like it's worth being put in my library. Okay, so that's just with me as a consumer. Okay, so let's go back to these traits of an innovator. Okay, psychology-wise, thrive on being the first to try new things and initiating change. Okay, that's another big thing, is that not only are they willing to try new things, but you want to find somebody who has a psychology that says, hey, if this thing is better than the status quo, I'm willing to go and actually initiate change within my hospital and within my peers that, hey, why are we doing it this old way? Let's solve the problem in this new way. Okay, very important. And then the motivation is that they have an excitement around new things. They need very minimal convincing, okay? Very, very minimal. So if you put this all together, who are we talking about? You're talking about somebody who, the moment you show them your product and you just talk to them through a few slides, they're excited, they're interested, and they're like ready to go, okay? If in the process of you presenting, and here's the litmus test for this, I tell founders all the time, your innovator is somebody that literally you can talk to without slides, without anything, and within 2 or 3 minutes, immediately they're nodding their head and they're like, yes, this, like, I've been wanting something like this, right? That's what you need, okay? If they come back and again, this is my rule of thumb, so you guys pressure test this yourself. If they start asking questions like, well, how many papers have you guys published on this? Who else is using it? This is the wrong person. And something that I want to point out when it comes to technology adoption curve, I don't know how to visually show this. Technology adoption happens much slower in a much more difficult way in our industry. And the reason why is that psychologically, if you think about a physician, physicians are not trained nor are they paid to do new things. Because if you do new things, not only could you potentially screw up and get sued, lose your license, but also your peers will attack you, okay? That's the one thing you have to keep in mind, right? Because think about it like this. If you're a surgeon, for example, and you spend 10, 15, 20 years becoming the very best at a very specific technique, and then somehow some random technology comes along that makes everybody, good at this one technique that you've perfected and done all these things over 15, 20 years. You've built your identity. You're making, you're living off of this. You think most people are just going to lay over and say, oh yeah, like this technology? Absolutely. They're going to fight tooth and nail. That's what you have to keep in mind, okay? Now, let's go over to early adopters. Now remember, this is the big thing. Early adopters, a lot more of them. Innovators, not as many. This is why it's so important to use marketing as soon as possible, specifically through social media, because that's something that scales. You going to conferences, I love conferences, that's not scalable, right? You doing webinars are great, that's not scalable. Using social media consistently, because you have to take the problem that you solve with the new solution that you have and put that in front of so many different audiences in so many different ways that it has to resonate with somebody, right? And you have to do this over a course of a year. So let's go to the early adopter side. Okay, so early adopter, again, based on percentage of market, look at that. You're talking about something that's almost 5 to 6 times larger. So innovators, 2.5% of your market. Early adopters, about 13.5%. Okay. What are the traits of the early adopters? They're persuasive, willing to work through bugs, concerned about reputation. Okay. Now, if you think about that as it compares to an innovator, innovators, they're excited, they're risk taker. Everything is great when you work with an innovator. When you work with an early adopter, they're going to work with you, but they're going to be coming back to you with recommendations and saying like, hey, this part sucks, you need to do this, etc. Okay. This is where you can see a lot of scope creep, in my opinion, on your product. Because when you work with the innovators, you get this high of like, oh man, they get the mission, they get the vision, they love these things and everything. And then you start getting to work with more early adopters, and now they're giving you feedback on how to make the product better. And then you have to start making decisions as to which ones to listen to and which ones not to. Because keep in mind, let's go back to this chart. At some point, you're going to, like, these people, you're going to leave them. I hate to say that. And if you think about a lot of companies, there's a lot of companies who have early market adopters, both innovators and early adopters, who not so crazy about the company anymore, because now they're like one of thousands of customers. They didn't get that special treatment. They know VIP stuff anymore, right? And so you have to depart at some point as a product and as a company, especially on the software side, which is very easy to start adding bells and whistles based on what these people tell you. At some point, you have to say, okay, we have to be very specific and decisive as to what features we're going to put money into doing, pulling out. Like, is this one feature worth doing that's going to help us move into the mainstream market more? Or is this just going to make this one person happy, right? That's what you have to keep in mind. All right, let's go back here. Okay, so on the psychology of an early adopter, they want to form a solid opinion of the technology before advocating for it. So, and they do like to appear trendy and informed. Keep in mind, okay, compare this to, again, I'm going to compare and contrast. Innovators, they want to be first and try new things. That's all that's what they care about. Early adopters, they're worried about what their peers are saying. They want to be innovative to their peers, but again, there's a public image, there's a social proof bias there that you are going to have to deal with, which is why if you look at their trait of an early adopter compared to an innovator, an early adopter is going to be a lot more hard on you about the product and what needs to change and how to improve it, because they're going to put their reputation on the line and go in front of a lot of their peers and everything. Believe it or not, innovators, not all of them, there are some that are like this, but a lot of them, they're kind of like an engineer in a funny way, in the sense that like they want to try new things, etc. But a lot of times what a company will make a mistake of is thinking that your innovator is going to be your podium person. It's rarely the case. Your innovator is the person to kind of get things into motion, provide a little bit of authority and social proof, help you move to early adopters, right? But a lot of times they're not the best person to put up on podium, to, even to do webinars sometimes, even though that might be the only choice you have, which is what you should use. But you need to move away from that and identify like, okay, this is our early adopter. Like the innovator, they're our ride or die. They're standing by our side through thick and thin, etc. The early adopter, it's like, hey, they believe in us, they love us, but at the same time, we got to make sure that they're happy. We got to work with them and make them look good, because if not, they're going to dump us, right? So, and as you can see, it's kind of like, if you think about this in terms of dating, it's like these people here, this is like they're head over heels in love with you. Early adopters, so innovators are like head over heels in love with you. Early adopters are like, they're like, yeah, like I really love you, like you're great and everything, but like, hey, like, if you start giving me problems, like we're breaking up. And the moment you get to like the mainstream market, these people this is like such a transaction. It's a contract at that point. It's like, hey, like what promises can you fulfill and like continue fulfilling for me? And if you can't, then I'm going to dump you. Okay. And this is why, like, there's a big difference between, as a company, who you are over here versus who you become over here. Okay. And I think the best companies find a way to kind of balance out both those areas where they function, like if you think about like Apple, okay, Apple's a mainstream market company, but they still try and do things where they kind of foster this early market sense, like when they do their Apple development days and they have like certain people that they work in, they bring in early to Apple. One of my the partners of my show, Showpad, right? When Steve Jobs released the iPad, like Apple was a mainstream product, but Showpad was actually one of the early companies that Steve was like, hey, I want to bring you guys in. You guys get the value of iPad, and I want you guys to be in the App Store. We're going to work with you to sort of roll that out, right? All right, going back here, all right, let's go to the last thing. Okay, on their motivation for an early adopter, hands-on, they want to do trainings, want to develop guides, and they value being seen as informed influencers, okay? Again, compare that to an innovator. There's excitement, they like the new thing. The innovator does not care about like, I want to be seen amongst my peers. They literally want to try and use new things, okay? Compared to the early adopter, there's a social proof bias there, okay? Now, if we just, put this up side by side, and again, feel free to take a screenshot of this, okay? Let's just compare this one by one, and then we're going to roll into Q&A, okay? For your innovators, if we look at their motivations, want to be first, they love novelty. Early adopters care about credibility and practical benefits. Risk tolerance. Innovators, high risk tolerance. They see failure as like, oh, this is a learning opportunity, okay? Early adopters, kind of moderate. They're willing to look at minor setbacks, but if your product like has big blazing failures, like they will dump you immediately. Because remember, the early adopter cares a lot more about their public reputation versus the innovator. And let me give you like something else to think about. If you look at a lot of companies, a lot of times they're early market people, the innovators, are usually it's like a surgeon in an ASC, maybe not at a massive academic center, everything. And those people, like, think about your average private practice surgeon, right? Like, if you think about Da Vinci in the early days when some private practice surgeons adopted it, like, private practice surgeons don't care about their perception to their peers because they're not publishing. They're like, whatever. But the moment you get to early adopters where you're like dealing with surgeons who are, let's say, in academic departments, they publish, they at least are seen at the society, they care a lot. They don't want their name and their brand to be associated with like a failure of a company, right? Role in adoption. Innovators are your initial testers and feedback providers. Early adopters, they're your influencers and internal champions. Big difference. I would even say, and again, this is take this with a grain of salt. Everybody's, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, but that doesn't disprove the rule, which is your innovators are your testing and product people. Your early adopters, those are your KOLs, right? Those are the people, those are the people that your sales and marketing team uses. Okay. And if you can find both, there are some people who straddle both those worlds. Rare to find, but I think it's easier to like put them into buckets and really just be disciplined as to saying like, okay, Dr. Smith versus Dr. Y, what bucket do they technically, if we had to force ourselves to put them in a bucket, which one would they fall into? Engagement approach, okay? Your innovators focus on exclusivity and exploration. Early adopters, they want to provide training and success data. Meaning, your innovators, again, they like to just know that like, oh, I'm special. I'm going to the company HQ. I'm going to help them with the R&D process. I'm going to, work on, like a new technique and give them feedback on a very specific feature. The early adopters are like, hey, as soon as things are pretty much buttoned up, I'll give you some feedback on the minor things, but I want to be the guy or gal who's going to publish some papers. I want to be like the best in the world. I want to train people, right? They're looking for that, okay? And then finally, on your key contributions, okay, your innovators highlighting potentials and limits of the technology, your early adopters bridging the gap between innovators and early majority, okay? And I really love, when I thought about this, I loved, kind of framing it that way, because if you look at this, okay, you have a chasm here. This early adopter group is really the bridge between your like super early market, like, hey, we love this like science project, and the mainstream market, which wants a whole product solution, okay? And if we look at, just to kind of wrap this up, if we look at your early majority, okay, right? And this is just to show you that's what gets you started here in the mainstream market is your early majority. So if you think about that as a bridge, okay, your early majority, if we look at traits, logical, practical, data-driven, right? What does early adopters want to do? They want to develop that data and they want to develop those best practices. Early majority, they need the proof of effectiveness. They're pragmatic, they're cautious. They want case studies, real-world applications. What's your early adopter? Your early adopter wants to be the one to say, hey, I was the first in the world to do 100 cases, 1,000 cases. I'm the one who trained. I'm the one who came up with these best practices, okay? Your early majority, evidence of problem solving, data, success stories. They want clear, logical arguments. The motivation of your early adopter fits that need, right? And that's the big thing that you guys have to think about this. When it comes to each one of these groups, what does each group technically need for you to move your adoption forward, okay? And so then the sooner you're able to figure that out, the sooner you're able to see like, hey, this is what we have to work with. There's nothing wrong with from now saying, hey, at some point, a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, we're hopefully getting into the early majority. We need to start publishing papers and start working that from now. That's fine. What I see too many companies do is if you get a FDA breakthrough designation, you got some papers published, that's great. That's not going to be enough. That's like a sprinkle on top for an innovator. That's not enough. The innovator wants the new thing, right? So that being said, let me come back to Zoom and unmute people. And then for those who are on LinkedIn, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in. Let me come back to Zoom real quick. And then if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself or drop it in. And actually here, we got some questions in the chat. So let me, let's see. All right, so questions. So we got a question from Greg. So Greg's question is, we have wearable devices for treating people after a stroke or neurological issue, and it helps to make sure the patient doesn't compensate for their issue. It actually retrains and rewires the brain to work the way it is supposed to. The hospitals and clinicians we speak to love it, but seem incented to keep things as they are so that patients remain in a disease state and therefore remain a long time clients. How do we work with this and find the right innovators and early adopters and try and pay for our technology into our clinics? So just to kind of summarize the question Greg's saying is that like, hey, we have a device, it has a great clinical outcome, etc., but it's at odds with a economic model that doesn't serve the hospital and the clinician. So in that case, that's an economic story. So you have to find a way to sort of tell an economic story to the clinician, to the hospital. Maybe it's with readmission rates, maybe it's like patient outcomes or patient satisfaction scores that's going to help them in some way. Unfortunately, healthcare is a business, so it's not enough just say, hey, this makes things better, because if that thing that makes better also costs the hospital money in the long term, it's very difficult to overcome that. No one's going to admit that, but that's just the facts. And so you have to figure out from the point of view of the hospital CEO and the clinician, how they interpret this new technology in terms of how it's going to affect and impact their economic story. So great question. Let's see. I'm going to come over to LinkedIn and see what questions do we have. We got a lot of people watching from LinkedIn, so welcome everybody. Okay, I got an anonymous question. Okay, very cool. So anonymous question says, let me move some windows here. So the anonymous question, one second. Okay, so anonymous question asks, what are the best ways for me to figure out if somebody's an innovator versus an early adopter? Okay, great question. Okay, I think, so when you meet with a physician, I think what's important to ask from the very beginning, and you should do this as part of your sales process across the board, is you should ask the clinician, these set of questions. So again, so to ask the question again, the question is, how do I figure out the difference between an innovator in the early market versus an early adopter in the early market? The best way to do that is that when you're able to meet with them, and specifically if they book time with you, the first question you should ask them is, why did you take my meeting? Why did you take my baby? Because that question by itself will immediately tell you who they're about. If they say something like, oh, like I was just wanting to get some more information, it seemed interesting, etc., then you have to ask some more questions. But if they say something like, yeah, like I've dealt with this clinical problem for a long time, and I always felt that like the best way to solve this old problem is through this new solution, and now I see that new solution is actually a potentially real thing. That's what got me interested. That's something, right? The other thing is, what I would try and do is try and do as much of this as possible over the phone, or more ideally, like through Zoom or in person. The reason why is that you want to see their face, you want to hear their tonality of their voice. You want to see, like, is this person getting like excited? Like, they're not jumping out of their seat excited, but you can tell when someone's genuinely excited about something. Their eyes kind of light up. And this is a very special moment in the adoption cycle, because many times your best innovators, and there are some innovators who they start as innovators and they're able to evolve into early adopters, is that there's some clinician out there who has never cared about tech, never cared about any of these things, but this one problem that you now solve through your technology is so important to them that they get activated through your mission, through your technology. That is somebody that's really, really good. And if you think about it psychologically, look at political movements, all these things, those people are gay because this is the first time that they've been activated, right? Think about it like this from a metaphysical way, or a psychological way. How excited can somebody like, I won't mention a name, but like your chair of surgery at HSS, or your chair of interventional cardiology at Cedars-Sinai, how excited are they going to get for your technology after having a 20-year career, 30-year career, or even if it's been 10 years, but they've seen all this tech? Like, it's really hard versus somebody who's, let's say, well into their career and everything, but they've never been like a KOL for a company. They never even worked with a company on product and feature. That person, more likely not only is excited, but they're coachable, right? So you can have very honest discussions with them and say, hey, when you work with our product team, do these things, do this, give us this kind of feedback. And now it's this new process. So it's not only the adoption of a new technology, it's a new experience. They've never talked to a company, and of course, there's always going to be some problems sometimes that come with that. But those people, I feel like, are extremely great because they're moldable, they're coachable. Great question. Let's see. I think I need to unmute people. Let me unmute people on. Don't unmute yourself unless you're going to ask a question, by the way. So anybody got a question on Zoom? All right. So questions. So we got a question from Greg. So Greg's question is, we have wearable devices for treating people after a stroke or neurological issue, and it helps to make sure the patient doesn't compensate for their issue. It actually retrains and rewires the brain to work the way it is supposed to. The hospitals and clinicians we speak to love it, but seem incented to keep things as they are so that patients remain in a disease state and therefore remain long-time clients. How do we work with this and find the right innovators and early adopters and try and pay for our technology into their clinics? So just to kind of summarize the question Greg's saying is that, like, hey, we have a device, it has a great clinical outcome, etc., but it's at odds with a economic model that doesn't serve the hospital and the clinician. So in that case, that's an economic story. So you have to find a way to sort of tell an economic story to the clinician, to the hospital. Maybe it's with readmission rates, maybe it's like patient outcomes or patient satisfaction scores that's going to help them in some way. Unfortunately, healthcare is a business, so it's not enough just say, hey, this makes things better, because if that thing that makes better also costs the hospital money in the long term, it's very difficult to overcome that. No one's going to admit that, but that's just the facts. And so you have to figure out, from the point of view of the hospital CEO and the clinician, how they interpret this new technology in terms of how it's going to affect and impact their economic story. So great question. Let's see. I'm going to come over to LinkedIn and see what questions do we have. We got a lot of people watching from LinkedIn, so Welcome, everybody. Oh, okay. I got an anonymous question. Okay, very cool. So anonymous question says, let me move some windows here. So the anonymous question, I mean, 1 second. Okay. So anonymous question asks, what are the best ways for me to figure out if somebody's an innovator versus an early adopter? Okay, great question. Okay. I think, so when you meet with a physician, I think what's important to ask from the very beginning, and you should do this as part of your sales process across the board, is you should ask the clinician, these set of questions. So again, ask the question again. The question is, how do I figure out the difference between an innovator in the early market versus an early adopter in the early market? The best way to do that is that when you're able to meet with them, and specifically if they book time with you, the first question you should ask them is, why did you take my meeting? Why did you take my meeting? Because that question by itself will immediately tell you who they're about. If they say something like, oh, I was just wanting to get some more information, it seemed interesting, etc., then you have to ask some more questions. But if they say something like, yeah, like I've dealt with this clinical problem for a long time, and I always felt that like the best way to solve this old problem is through this new solution, and now I see that new solution is actually a potentially real thing. That's what got me interested. That's something, right? The other thing is, what I would try and do is try and do as much of this as possible over the phone, or more ideally, like through Zoom or in person. The reason why is that you want to see their face, you want to hear their tonality of their voice. You want to see, like, is this person getting excited? Like, they're not jumping out of their seat excited, but you can tell when someone's genuinely excited about something. Their eyes kind of light up. And this is a very special moment in the adoption cycle, because many times your best innovators, and there are some innovators who they start as innovators and they're able to evolve into early adopters, is that there's some clinician out there who has never cared about tech, never cared about anything, but this one problem that you now solve through technology is so important to them that they get activated through your mission, through your technology. That is somebody that's really, really good. And if you think about psychologically, look at political movements, all these things, those people are gay because this is the first time that they've been activated, right? Think about it like this from a metaphysical way, or a psychological way. How excited can somebody like, I won't mention a name, but like your chair of surgery at HSS, or your chair of interventional cardiology at Cedars-Sinai, how excited are they going to get for your technology after having a 20-year career, 30-year career, or even if it's been 10 years, but they've seen all these tech, like, it's really hard, versus somebody who's, let's say, well into their career and everything, but they've never been like a KOL for a company. They never even worked with a company on product and feature. That person, more likely not only is excited, but they're coachable, right? So you can have very honest discussions with them and say, hey, when you work with our product team, do these things, do this, give us this kind of feedback. And now it's this new process. So it's not only the adoption of a new technology, it's a new experience. They've never talked to a company, and of course, there's always going to be some problems sometimes that come with that. But those people, I feel like, are extremely great because they're moldable, they're coachable. Great question. Let's see. I think I need to unmute people. Let me unmute people on don't unmute yourself unless you're going to ask a question, by the way. So what, anybody got a question on Zoom?
Omar, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Greg, go ahead. Greg first, and then Mark.
Hey, I posted in the chat, but real quick, we have a technology that's a wearable, and it's
oh yeah, I answered that question earlier, Greg. I think you walked away.
Oh, I stepped out literally for 30 seconds. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Anything you want to ask me about that?
Yeah, so definitely go back and re-listen to this episode, but I'll just quickly answer it here, which is in that case where, again, Greg's question was around if you have a great technology, but then your hospital administrator and clinician may not adopt it because it essentially kills a revenue stream for them with a patient because it kind of solves the problem very quickly. Then you got to think about the clinical outcome and economic story you're going to tell that clinician, where it's like, hey, yes, like, I'm gonna make this up outside of everything. Like, if there's a patient that the hospital is going to make, they're going to bill the insurance $10,000 a year for, and the patient shows up to your clinic once a month, right? But you have a product that solves this thing in one visit, right? And it only costs, the hospital only bills $2,000, so they're losing out $8,000 a year per patient, right? So how do you get a hospital to overcome that? You have to find very creative ways outside of to say, hey, maybe you lose $8,000 of revenue from each patient because we solve this problem immediately. But think about your patient satisfaction scores, which is extremely important for the hospital. Think about your outcomes data, all these things. So that's where you have to start interviewing your clinician and your hospital administrator. Say, hey, we are struggling by driving adoption with other hospitals for these ways. Can you explain what's the best way to overcome this? Don't sit in a room and whiteboard this with yourself. The most valuable asset you have as a company are your existing customers who adopted despite all these things. So you have to get into their heads and understand, like, what tools of persuasion, what variables of persuasion do we have to pull so that we can bake that into our pitch and into our value prop so that we can overcome those objections before they even happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Perfect. Absolutely, no problem.
Do you want to comment on the healthcare system right now is incentive for disease management and caring for patients versus where the healthcare system we think where it needs to go, where it should be, is towards generate health and get people out of that cycle?
I'm going to avoid commenting on that, and the reason why is because if I do, I'm going to go off on a major tangent. But yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, we do have a system that is more of a sick care system, and the incentive is to constantly be adding more top of funnel to sort of grow revenue streams. I mean, it's unfortunate, but that's what happens when, like, a lot of these companies that control, like, how people are paid, they're publicly traded companies with a fiduciary responsibility. So, like, in that case, like, they're going to find every single way to make more money and not, like, pay money to treat certain things. So yeah, I won't comment too much on that, but yeah, I agree with you. Mark, let's go to you because I want to make sure we get to all the questions on time. Oh, you're muted. Oh, I need to ask you to unmute.
Okay. I couldn't ask for what I wanted, so I was hoping you got it intuitively. Omar, you always make great content. I'm fully with you with using the market adoption curve or bringing your product to market. And in this chat, I think you did a really good job of basically telling us what comments we should take from customers and which ones we should implement and which ones we should not. That was a really, really good point that not a lot of people make. That the customer is king and we should do everything that they say. And a lot of companies waste a lot of energy.
A lot of energy and time. And here's the other thing. I'm so happy you brought that up, which is, again, when you're a founder, when you're a startup, it feels so good to like, after struggling for so long, to get a few good customers who, like, get it, right? And you want to do everything for these people because, like, they're like your first love, right? The problem, though, is that when you do this, keep in mind, this person, you're not going to be married to this person for forever. There's going to be new customers who come on board. And so then when those new customers come on, you have to think about, okay, like, if we roll out the red carpet and do all the special treatment for these 1, 2, 3 surgeons, what are the other surgeons going to come on and ask for? They're going to ask for that same treatment because they all talk, and it becomes a huge problem. Like, they'll bring it up and be like, hey, what the hell? Like, I wanted this one feature and it's really important. You don't do it, but then Dr. So-and-so, you did all these other features that they've requested, and it becomes very, very awkward. So, like, what I would recommend is that you have to have these conversations very early with these people. Something that else that comes up is that, and just because it's just like when it comes to giving equity in your company, you start a company, you hire some, like, engineers or something, and you want to give them equity. You gotta be very careful with that because that one engineer, that one product leader earlier in a company who does all these things at the early stage may not be that valuable later on. but now they have like a lot of equity in company. Equally so when it comes to your clinical adopters, some of those surgeons immediately feel like, okay, I'm an early adopter, or I've been with the company from the beginning. I want to be on their advisory board. Got to be careful with that. And you have to talk to the companies, talk to them very specifically about this and say, hey, like we have a very specific process, got to go through the board and everything. They should not feel like it's up to the CEO, because at that point, you're going to end up getting up in a lot of arguments where like, oh, like I've done all this work for the company. I helped you guys a lot. Why can't you make me a clinical advisor? Which, by the way, comes with equity and all kinds of rights. You don't want to use that, because guess what? When you move up the adoption curve, you get to early adopters, maybe you're getting close to a certain market share, and you land a whale of a physician where you're like, oh, this person has worked with multiple companies, exited them, all these things. That's the person you should consider giving like an advisory role to, versus your innovator. Great, they're going to give you great product feedback and everything, but like to have a successful company, product and feature feedback is like one of many, many check boxes you need. That makes sense?
Yeah. My question, I've read the book Crossing the Chasm, and there's a lot of debate about how big of a jump in innovation your product is. And a lot of founders believe that what they make is really a big jump. Omar, how big of a jump do you believe your product should be? Or is there like a feeling that you have about how big the jump should be in order for that adoption curve to be used or not?
Got it. So the question is that, like, how big of a jump do you need for your product to not adhere to the adoption curve? Is that the question? I may have misunderstood.
How much innovation is enough innovation to consider this now, okay, this is now a new market adoption curve. We've actually made something substantial enough that people view this as breaking the mold.
Oh, okay, got it. You're still going to have, okay. So for one, I'm going to just say this right now. 99.9% of companies are not like revolutionary. Okay. Like, and if they were, it would be reflected immediately in your revenue. Like, I'll give you a revolutionary company, ChatGPT. ChatGPT in their first month did $4 billion in revenue. All right. So whenever a founder comes to me like, oh, we have a amazing revolutionary product, I'm like, why aren't you doing billions of dollars of revenue yet? Or even tens of millions or even millions, right? So that's number one. The second thing is that even with ChatGPT, as like wildly successful it is and extremely overvalued, I think. I mean, it's a great company, but like their valuation is insane. They still are going through the technology adoption curve, because do it as a test. Go talk to like 10 people you know and ask them, how often are you using ChatGPT and to what extent? So you still go through this technology adoption curve in terms of like how many people are using it and to what extent, right? So no matter how revolutionary your product is, that adoption curve is still going to apply. Now, the difference though is that you might have something where you have a smaller phase of innovators, for example, you know, so those phases, those areas might change slightly, but you still end up going through it, you know, no matter what the product is. And sometimes I personally believe, and by the way, 2 books I'm going to recommend 2 books for you. Give me 1 second. Here we go. I love when I know where these books are. So 2 books just to understand the chasm, I think, that are really good. Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, which talks about like breakthrough revolutionary technologies. And then Jeff Moore actually wrote a book called Inside of the Tornado, which is really specific about the chasm. Okay. Now, the thing about revolutionary technology is that sometimes if your product is so new and revolutionary, it's actually harder because it's so different. It's very difficult to get people to actually adopt it, right? That's why sometimes like really breakthrough technologies, they're just slight iterations on something that's already existing, where it's new enough to get attention, but similar enough that like people can get what it is. Like, I'll give you a great example is like the iPad. The iPad is like one of Apple's most successful products. I think maybe more, almost, or as successful as the iPhone. But imagine there was no iPhone. They just came out with the iPad. That happened back in the 90s. Like, I think Microsoft had a tablet. Huge failure because it was such a different technology. Like, no one knew what the hell to do. But when you had Apple introduce the iPad, people kind of get it. They're like, oh, okay, this is like my iPhone, but like a little bit bigger, and I can't make phone calls on it. All right, cool. And a lot of people made fun of it because they said it was so stupid. Those are or late majority mainstream market people. I was one of them. I'll admit right now, when it came out, I was like, this is the dumbest thing ever. This is a big, iPhone that I can't like make calls on. Why would I need this? Right? It's not a computer. It's not an iPhone. But it fit a very specific market, and Innovators adopted it like Showpad. My partner Showpad, they were the ones who saw the future. That's why they're called Showpad, adopted it for sales enablement, right? And that, they became who they are today. And so all technologies go through that cycle. It just depends on what the technology is and what the market is. I hope that kind of answers the question. It is a really good question. Awesome. Let me go over to LinkedIn and see. We got any questions here on LinkedIn. No questions on LinkedIn, but a lot of comments. So I appreciate everybody's kind words there. Let me see. Okay, we got a couple anonymous questions here. Let me read the anonymous questions. So anonymous questions is, this is an interesting one. So the question is, Omar, we have a surgeon who is clearly an innovator. They've been with us for a long time. But now we're moving up as a company and we are working with early adopters, and this person wants to be an early adopter / KOL, but they're clearly not. What do we do? That's a tough one. Okay, so let me paint the picture. As a company, you get an innovator. Again, we're talking about somebody who's like, a scientist practically, tech enthusiast. Okay, they love new technology. They adopt your product. They're giving you feedback, etc. Okay, now you're growing as a company, you get some KOLs. This person probably saw those KOLs either getting compensated, maybe you guys did a webinar. They got some kind of like a public image thing going. And now that innovator might be jealous, maybe they want, or not even jealous, they're just like, oh, I want that to be me. But they're not that person. Maybe they just don't have the respect of their peers, maybe they're not well known, etc. And so what I would say is find a medium ground, right? There's always value in creating content. And this is, to me, where as a marketing leader, you can serve almost like a talent agent, okay? So create the content. So if they want to be like a KOL, just say, hey, like, look, we have to be very mindful of the resources we have, the time, etc. But why don't we do a test, okay? Let's say a webinar. And I think a webinar is a great low-cost way to do these things. If you need help, always reach out to me. My agency, we do webinars all the time and live streams. But I would say, like, do a webinar with them, coach them, and and do it as a test and say, hey, like, we want to just see, like, are you able to attract a lot of people? Are you able to do this, that, and everything? And let's see how the content goes. That way they get a little bit of love, they get some recognition, and then you're able to test, because sometimes you might say, I don't think anybody's going to show up for this. And then you do this, type of webinar, and a lot of people show up, or not a lot of people show up, but they're convincing enough to a small enough group of people that they have influence. And so there's something there for you to work and coach on. So a lot of times with clinicians, you can see them almost like talent, like as a movie star or something, right? And so maybe there's a way to sort of bolster them up, because again, in my opinion, I think it's way more valuable when you have somebody who is an avid fan, like a true believer in technology, and they're giving webinars and they're posting content, versus somebody who's like got the authority, but they're not giving a full-throated endorsement of your product, right? And at the end of the day, I really believe in energy and excitement around your product. It is contagious, So I think you have to work that out. Now, the other side of it is that if this person wants to become a KOL and part of it is like financially motivated, that's where it becomes really tricky. You want to show them some love. I think like do the webinar and pay them for that. But you got to be very careful in terms of setting a tone for that, because it could be very quickly a slippery slope, because you can run into the issue where they want to do more events for you or have more physicians visit them and everything. They just want to bill a lot, and you got to make sure that they have an understanding that you get to decide that, not them, right? And again, at the end of the day, I think too many companies, and sorry, I'm sort of taking a long time on this topic because it's an important one. I think too many startups are sensitive about paying physicians. But keep in mind, a physician already has a lot on their plate, and so for them to create content or do trainings or all these things, they have to be compensated. Like you want to do good business, right? So it's very important to do that. And just because you're paying them money doesn't mean they're like less of a fan of the product. But like if a physician is going to, put their professional brand on the line, stick their neck out for you guys, create content, do all of these things, and the byproduct of that is like tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars of revenue, they have a right to be like, hey, like I should be paid for some of this, right? That's only good business. Again, like you can adopt the product as a clinician because you feel like it's a great product for your patient, and at the same time say, hey, look, if I'm going to help your company, I should be paid for my efforts and time. You have to be willing to have that discussion. Another question here. What do you recommend a company does to bridge that chasm and gap? Because the early startup typically doesn't have the funds to wait the time between their development efforts and their approval and adoption curve to convert sales. Yeah, so honestly, the best way to bridge that gap is if I audited every single company that's come to me on my show and they've just like, oh, we don't have money, and I audit what they spend on, there's money there. So, for example, again, I have a bias to this. I worked in a lot of different companies. There are some companies where you don't need an agency, but there's a lot of startups who overspend on sales and marketing hires, and they can honestly cut a lot of that spending in half by just saying, hey, early days, we are going to hire out an agency to do a lot of this work for us. Maybe we have one or two marketers internally, but we have an agency to execute a lot of these things, right? That's the way to do it, honestly. You have to invest in these things. And I would say like even make these considerations like, okay, everybody wants to go to conferences. Even if you don't exhibit at a conference, it's going to cost you maybe like $4,000 to $5,000, maybe a little bit more, just on sending people there via, through flights and hotels and everything. Maybe you have to ask yourself, it's like, yeah, you know what? Like, do we need to attend this conference, or can we use like $5,000 and like put it towards like some, content that we can create, marketing efforts, etc. Right? So I think a lot of companies are just not good at how they spend their marketing budget. And so those are the hard questions to ask. But again, to answer the question about how do you accelerate and close that gap to the chasm, it's getting to those innovators, and more specifically, preparing your company to a point where an early adopter KOL feels comfortable enough to be public about their adoption with you, right? And then sometimes at the end of the day, like, you can't get past a crappy product. The product has to be good. It doesn't have to be great, but it has to be good and reliable. If it's not, then like you got bigger problems. So, and by the way, just to add to that is that in terms of digital marketing efforts, keep in mind, like while you're doing a song and dance for the market, investors and VCs are seeing all of this. And so again, like a lot of founders don't invest in marketing. No one knows about their company, including prospects. They go and spend money on attending conferences and these things where it's not like seen by everybody. And then they wonder like, well, how come VCs or investors aren't interested? It's because they don't know. And so you have to think about like leverage. What's the thing that gives me the most leverage over time that's scalable? There's a reason why this election was won through podcasts and social media. Like these things, our industry isn't isolated from those things as well. Great question. All right, we're at time. I'm going to take one or two more questions. So let me check on LinkedIn. If you had a question on Zoom, go ahead and unmute yourself, or just I guess raise your hand or drop something in the chat. Oh, Mark, go ahead. You get the last question. Oh, I gotta unmute you. Yeah, I'm not gonna do that again. I gotta figure out my Zoom settings. Go ahead, Mark.
No worries, Omar. When marketing your product, would you prefer to market your efforts towards innovators or early adopters if you had a choice?
Oh,
Because you could really create content which sort of answers problems that a typical innovator might have. It might attract them, and then you get the benefits from them. Or you could try to target at early adopters.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends on the stage of the company, but I would say both and all of them. And so here's the way that I like to think about this is that if you think about your technology adoption curve, think about it like this: is that the old way is like you and I are in the woods and there's a bunch of houses and we're gonna go knocking on each house to see like who lives in there and see if they're gonna they want to come and join our tribe, right? It takes a lot of effort. That's the equivalent of that is just hiring a sales team, right? It's really expensive, okay? The other side of it though is to build a fire. You build a bigger and bigger fire where people see it and they come out of the woods to come towards that fire, all right? And that's what marketing does. Now, in that process though, right? In that process, that fire, you can call it the problem you solve, the category you design, and the message you have, okay? Which to some extent is going to resonate with everyone if you do it the right way, to a certain degree. It might resonate more with like innovators and tech enthusiasts more than like mainstream market. But if you position your product on solving a very specific problem in a specific way, it'll attract everybody. And at that point, this is why having digital and a CRM set up is important. At that point, you pack all those people in your CRM, and then you start to figure out like, oh, based on engagement, right? Like there's a surgical robotics company we did this for. We got them almost 200 surgeon leads, okay? But of those 200 surgeon leads, like I think only 20 of them advanced to like a specific level of demo, and then they closed 3 deals, okay? So what happened to everybody else? Everybody else is more mainstream market. They just need to be nurtured and engaged over time versus when you do this, and again, think about it like you're catching a bunch of fish. You're not going to eat all those fish, right? But once you get all those fish, you're like, oh, these are the ones that work now, right? And so that's the key, that's the key here. You know, and the thing about it is that like when you put out this message, it might resonate with a small group of people, a little bit less with another, but you refine that message over time. But again, it all goes back to figuring out the problem you solve, the old problem you solve, in what new way, and then positioning it. And then you sort of have to do this marketing, guerrilla marketing jujitsu, right? Where you're putting that message in different forms of content through different media in front of different audiences over time and seeing what resonates, what doesn't, right? And again, this doesn't have to cost money. Set up a free HubSpot account, start putting out content on social media, and then monitoring who's visiting your site, right? And then you can sort of see like, oh, like this one contact has visited our site like multiple times. They've downloaded things, etc. Like that seems to be, there's some interest there. Monitor your social media. Like, oh, every time we put out a post, like these 2 or 3 doctors, they seem to always like every other post, everything. You have to, this is a constant practice, and it's difficult, right? But that's why it works. That's why you'll be able to start fulfilling those different areas of an adoption curve sooner. But to answer your question, like sort of in a summary, you have to market to all these people, right? And just know that that message is going to resonate a lot with some people more than others. But again, that's where you start figuring out like who is who, right? And when you deal with people, it's a great exercise for marketers and salespeople to kind of do the mental exercise of like, who am I talking to today? And it's like, okay, here's who I think I'm talking to. Okay, it's, you know, the chair of surgery for this private practice hospital, they're in private practice. So like maybe they're an early market person, maybe they're a mainstream market person. Here are the questions I'm going to ask. Hey doctor, what made you take this call today? Oh, you know, and based on that, it's like, how excited are they? It's like, great. What, you know, in the past, like, have you adopted any new tech? It's like, oh, you know, this and that. It's like, okay, you know, where do you sit? Like, so by asking all these questions, now you start pressure testing your hypothesis of who they are versus the questions they answer, and who, like, you start to find that out really, really quickly, right? And that's when you start categorizing and then deciding over time in your CRM where you, your marketing agency, your team should live as to, okay, based on our hypotheses, based on the information we're gathering, we need to put a lot of attention and focus on these 2 or 3 deals, because these are the ones that will make the company move forward. And these other deals, we just got to, put them on our email list, do some value added follow up with them, keep them in touch and everything, and kind of move along with them. But like the most important thing, the reason why why did I do this talk today on the chasm? It wasn't so much about the technology adoption curve. It was more about figuring out very quickly who and where are you going to spend your time and resources first, right? That's the thing. That's the biggest thing. And I think if you think about what causes a company to fail, their inability to be focused and disciplined with their time and resources. That's the biggest thing. Oh, go ahead, Mark. Yeah, I have to ask you to unmute. I need to figure out.
I won't touch the button again. Your last part kind of contradicts the first. I really liked your first analogy with the bonfire or whatever to get people attracted to you. So you kind of have to. It's that you didn't contradict. I guess you have to find the balance with. You need to create a market campaign that gets the attention, that brings the people to you. And then it's kind of like at a party that you have at your place. You kind of have to know who around you.
That's exactly correct.
And of course, if you feel like you don't need a lot of sales contacts, you should try to close them. If there is,
that's exactly correct. Yeah, I mean, look. That's exactly the right analogy. And I'll use my own business as an example of this, which is like, look at how much content I put out. I put all this content out, and like literally in my CRM, I think I have like 70 to 80 deals just sitting there at different stages. Why is it that many? But of those 70 or 80, I'm really actively working 5 or 10. And the reason why is that the moment I talk to people, it's like, oh, this person isn't a true believer. Like I was talking to somebody this week who immediately, first conversation when I talked to them about the use of content and podcasting and digital, they're like, 100% agree with you. And I was like, great. So this person gets it. I didn't show them slides. I didn't have to show them testimonials. I didn't have to show them any. They immediately get it, and they're moving through my pipeline really fast. Versus another group where I've been talking to them for like a year and a half. They get it, but they're still like, oh, give us an update. Like, do you have any new case studies? Do you have this? And I'm like, no, I don't have any new case studies. Because and the problem, the mistake in every sale is spending too much time trying to convince the ladder that I just described to close, when in reality, they're not going to close. They're doing a song and dance. Like it's not even a no. It's worse. It's a maybe. And with those people, what you have to consider is that like these people need 2 things. They need time and more reasons to believe. And if you add and stack that over more and more and more, at some point, they're just going to come flying through your pipeline. So for example, there's another deal that I worked for my agency where the company, I was in touch with them for like 9 months, literally 9 months. The deal got closed within a period of a week because there was a certain pain point that they hit, and the combination of that pain point, the timing, and the amount of content they've seen from me convince them like, this is the solution we need right now. And they moved extremely fast. And this is how you have to think about deals, which is like, okay, like these people are asking for these things. You have to ask yourself like, okay, if I actually had these things that the person's asking for, like a paper, a case study, are they going to move that much faster? And the likelihood is probably not. You have to feel like a sense of urgency. And that's why, again, I'm very big about spending as little time engaging through email and online. And it's like, I need to get them on a Zoom. I need to see their face. I need to hear their voice. Because then I can tell like, oh yeah, this person gets it. They're ready to go. And they're willing to like do the things that I'm going to tell them to do to get this deal forward. The same thing with clinicians. That makes sense?
That's great, Omar. Thanks a lot for taking the extra time to take.
Oh, my pleasure. Great questions. Great questions. And I want to thank everybody for joining once again. If you want to join these Zoom calls, so we do these for free. There's a link in the show notes. If you're listening to this on the podcast, if you're on LinkedIn, check the post and go ahead and join it. Or you can go to the website. We have a website. You can go to, let me confirm it, stateofmedtechpodcast.com, and you'll be able to see there a place to register for the newsletter, but also for MedTech Growth Letters. So with that being said, be sure to subscribe to the show. Thank you all for the great questions, and we'll see you all next time. Bye for now.